Every day, some of America's finest men and women take to the skies to defend freedom at home and around the world. They are judged not by their race or the color of their skin, but only by their ability and bravery. This was not always the case, however, for there was a time in American history when only white men were allowed to serve in our nation's Air Corps. In fact, a 1925 Army research report went as far as to say that, in physical courage, it must be admitted that the American Negro falls well back of the white race. It was in this world of prejudice and misconception that a young man stepped forward, risking life and limb to fly a rickety, rented biplane from Chicago to Washington to fight for racial equality in the military. This is the story of Chauncey Spencer and his historic fight for racial equality. Born November 5th in 1906 in Lynchburg, Virginia, Chauncey was the only son of Edward and Ann Spencer. His mother was a librarian and very talented Harlem Renaissance poet. Visitors to the home included W.E.B. Du Bois, George Washington Carver, Paul Robeson, and Thurgood Marshall. They talked about theater, literature, and civil rights. While Chauncey grew up in a home filled with hope and ambition, he was not immune from the discrimination that surrounded him. Like many young men of his day, he was inspired to fly by American heroes like the Wright brothers and Charles Lindbergh. Chauncey recalls his mother showing him his first airplane.
And I came running out to see what she said, and she pointed up in there, and that's when I saw the first plane flying over Lynchburg, going out to the airport. So the next week, my father says, "How do you feel about it?" I said, "Come on, get in the car with me." And he drove out to the airport. It wasn't Lynchburg Airport at that time. I can't think of the name of it. I'll come up with it. And we drove Preston Glen Airport. And my father and I walked on in to see the pilot in charge. And father said, "My son wants to take flying lessons." And without any question, the man hardly looked up. He said, "We don't teach colored to fly."
But Chauncey never gave up his dream to fly, and finally, at the suggestion of Illinois Congressman Oscar Dupree, he joined a group of young African-American flyers at the Coffey School of Aviation at Chicago's Harlem Airport. It was here that he finally received a student's pilot license. Chauncey was finally off the ground, but he still couldn't get away from the racial discrimination because nobody wanted a Negro pilot, not even the armed forces. It was 1939 and America was preparing for war against Hitler by initiating civilian pilot training programs, but these programs were for whites only. This same year, Chauncey and his friends in Chicago formed the National Airmen's Association, whose sole purpose was to promote aviation for African Americans. By conducting air shows and making promotional tours, they hoped to prove their ability and gain public attention for their cause. With the success of the air shows, in May 1939, the association, along with the Chicago Defender, an African-American newspaper, sponsored Chauncey Spencer and fellow flyer Dale White on a 10-city tour. They would climax their tour by going to Washington to urge Congress to include funds for black flight schools to be included in the civilian pilot training program. With a rented old biplane and a few dollars in their pockets, they began their fateful flight.
That morning was clear, crystal clear, and we took off. Now here we are taking off. We've already filled up with gas. We're on our way to Washington. So we're flying along, and Dale had said to me, you take it over."
Only 3.5 hours into the flight, they were forced to crash land in a farmer's field in Ohio. 2 days later, after they had raised money for a new crankshaft and made the repairs, they were back in the sky. Stopping in West Virginia for fuel, airport officials wouldn't let them stay, forcing them to fly on to Pittsburgh even though it was getting dark. With no way to see the runway, they followed the lights of a larger passenger plane to land in the darkness. Aviation officials were not impressed and grounded the pilots and made them appear at a hearing where they were reprimanded for following the plane too closely. Finally, they were free to continue along their way to Washington. Once in Washington, they went to the Capitol to meet the congressman.
And just as we got down to the first landing, this man said, "Oh, hello, Edgar. How are you?" And he said, "Fine, Senator, fine. All right, fine." He said, "Who are your friends?" Who are these two young men? And Big Mouth me comes in again. I said, we're trying to get into the Air Corps." He said, "Well, why don't you join?" And then Dale spoke up and said, we can't get in. It's restricted for whites only." He said, "Are you citizens of the United States?" And we said, yes. And he said, do you vote? And we said, yes. He said, where's your airplane? And we told him. He said, how about me coming out there and taking a look at it at 3 o'clock? Well, we didn't know that at that time, we didn't know his name was Harry Truman. See, he was a senator from Missouri. So he looked at that, we got out there, and he was there, but he had 4 men with him, and they were administrators from his office. And he said, is that the plane you all flew from Chicago? And I said, yes, sir, that's it. I said, would you like to take a flight? He said, no, but if you got guts enough to fly that thing from there, from Chicago to here, I got guts to see that you do get into the Air Corps. And he did.
By the end of that year, Congress passed a civilian pilot training program that included money for flight training programs at black colleges. Spencer and White had helped to break the color barrier in the U.S. Air Corps. The groundwork had been laid for the first African-American squad at the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. The Tuskegee Airmen overcame prejudice to become one of the most highly successful fighter groups of World War II. By the end of the war, Tuskegee had trained over 990 pilots, 450 of which saw combat overseas. These men never lost a bomber under their protection and were the only unit in the war that could make that claim. They had proven conclusively that African Americans could fly. Spencer sought to join the Tuskegee Airmen but was told he was too old to fly. Wanting to stay close to flying, he became a civilian personnel officer working at Patterson Field in Dayton, Ohio, the beginning of a long career in public service. Years would pass before the nation would come to appreciate and recognize the significance of this historic flight. In 1983, Spencer was inducted into the Virginia Aviation Hall of Fame. He is also part of a special Black Wings exhibit at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. Finally, in 2001, at the age of 94, he was welcomed to the floor of the Virginia General Assembly and honored with a special proclamation. It was the very legislative body that in 1902, just 4 years before Chauncey's birth, had passed Jim Crow laws that restricted the rights of African Americans. Spencer's life had come full circle. He said it best in his autobiography, "I have to leave some impression in this world. I have to try to make an impact. I have to fight for what I believe in." Chauncey Spencer died in 2002, and the record shows that he clearly fought for what he believed in, and along the way he left our world a better place.
Oh, beautiful, far heroes proved in liberating strife. Who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life. America, America, make God thy gold refined, till all success be